just feel like this is a very, very important message for those that are going through catastrophic times or have been through. And the last 3 sessions that we've had, we talked about what happens when you first find out something catastrophic in your life. And there's all sorts of things that can happen. There's a lot of people today that found out some catastrophic news, as we know, that they didn't plan on. But what I want to do is to kind of go in and show you as we begin to pull out of the shock and the sorrow and all those things and begin to see the light on the other side of the tunnel. How many of you know that God is so good that He can take some of the worst things in the world and give you a testimony at the end of them? Now that takes time sometimes, it really does, and we're going to look at an example here, but you can turn to 2 Samuel, and we're going to be looking at chapter 12, and kind of just working our way through chapter 12. And we're going to be talking about David, but before we go there, let me kind of review. I think maybe you might try to put this message on Facebook, and so I want people to be able to kind of go back and catch up to where we've been the last several sessions. So, we've been talking about 6 different phases or 6 responses or reactions when you have a major loss in your life. Maybe you lose your job, maybe you lose your health, maybe you lose your spouse, maybe you lose a loved one through death, maybe you lose your credibility. Whatever it is, everybody goes through losses in this life. It is just part of life. Now, when we get to heaven, there will be no losses. But on this side, Jesus said, in this world, you'll have tribulation. The second part of that verse, he says, but take heart because I've overcome the world. In other words, in Him, we can be more than conquerors. So, the 6 phases that we've been looking at, we looked at shock, and then we talked about sorrow, and then we talked about struggle. We've talked about those so far. And now, tonight, we want to kind of lift up out of this, and we want to begin to get on the redemptive side of a catastrophic event. And so tonight, we want to talk about surrender, and then the next couple of nights, we're going to talk about, Sunday nights, we're going to talk about sanctification and service. So, let's just review. The first thing that you go through when you find out catastrophic news, you come home and you find a note that says, I don't love you anymore, I'm leaving. Boom. Out of nowhere. Or you get that knock on the door and it's a police officer and he says your son or your daughter has been in a wreck. I remember when I was youth pastor at Pine Level, sweet, sweet girl was in my youth group. And I get a frantic call that this girl has been in a wreck. And my daughter came home, Daddy, we just saw her at Bojangles as we were going over the hill there. And she got into a car, and she got in a wreck, and died. That's a long trip to the ER. Right there in Smithfield. Was in my youth group. And it changed just like that. And that's what we're talking about, what we've been talking about. And this stuff is hard because it brings so many emotions out in all of us. But so when you first hear the news, there's shock. And what did we say then? We did a whole message on shock. And what we talked about, we said that that is the time that we're crying out to God and let others help you. And so sometimes we just need to show up when people are in shock. You don't have to have all the answers. You just go wrap your arm around them. Tell them that you love them. Just be there. So the first thing that happens is that shock. And then it moves to the next phase after the shock, after you have been hit with shock, it moves to sorrow. And in sorrow, you move from feeling numb to feeling grief. And grief is a healthy thing. Not going through grief is a very unhealthy thing. And so you've had the shock, you heard it, and you just like, most of the time they're like, no, I don't believe this. And again, we're talking about catastrophic events here. When you go through something that is just overwhelming. And I really believe probably the most overwhelming thing you can go through is the loss of a child. I've been in several situations as a pastor out in Manly Grove. I got there and got a phone call. And the pianist said, you got to get to the hospital. And a little girl, I think was 3 years old, had drowned. And doing that funeral was the hardest thing that I ever had, because to me, perfectly healthy. But just kind of time lapsed and she got out of sight just like that and drowned. I've been in those situations. I've worked at clinical pastor education at Wake Med Hospital. And I was on call when a van was coming from somewhere up north headed to Myrtle Beach down through Raleigh. There's a mom and a dad and 3 kids, all healthy, just like you and me, no big deal, good jobs. Everything was together, and they get in a wreck, and the kids survive, but you don't have a mom and dad. These were 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds. And things change in a flash, and it's heart-rending. And so you move from shock to sorrow, and we had a whole message on going through grief. Excuse me. And then we talked about, at our last meeting here, we talked about the struggle. If in shock you feel numb, and in sorrow you feel sad, in the struggle you feel angry. I mean, it's just that. I mean, you're angry. It's just the truth. You really are. You're getting a little angry, perhaps, at God. Why is this happening? That's the why question of life. And so this message tonight, we want to move to surrender, and we want to talk about the path to peace. So when you've gone through a catastrophic event, the loss of a child, I think, is probably ranks up the highest one that would be the worst. But I mean, it's loss of job, a good job. It's loss of a marriage. It is, I mean, a number of things. A spouse dies. We want to begin to see that as you've gone through these different areas of shock and sorrow and kind of hit that anger point, we want to begin to pull out and see, and we're going to use David, because how many of you know David lost the baby? And we're going to go in that story. The worst thing that I think can happen is lose a child, and we're going to look at David tonight, and we're going to see how David finally, he went through these emotions, those 3 that we mentioned, and they're very natural and they're very healthy to work through those emotions. Remember, we even talked about to lament to God. I mean, you just cry out, why in the world is this happening to me? That's okay. To say, Lord, I don't understand. That lament, there's a whole Bible, a book of the Bible, Lamentations, where they're crying out, Lord, why is this happening? If you read the Psalms, a lot of times they're lamenting. And so what we want to do is, the next couple of weeks, is to see how that God can take something catastrophic, and in time, and it takes time. I mean, this stuff doesn't happen in a day. You don't go through shock, sorrow, and all those things. And it takes different time for different people. Some people say, well, don't you think it's about time for so-and-so to move on? She's still in the grieving stage. Well, how long is somebody supposed to grieve? I don't know. And I know when you have a catastrophic event, you never totally get over it. You're different from that point on. But I still believe, because it's right here in the Bible, and we're going to take the story of David, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, and we're going to see that he lost a child, and we're going to see how he surrendered and how he was on the pathway to peace. And that's what we want to establish. So I've just kind of backed up and did a review for those who may be watching the video. And so now we want to move to the section in 2 Samuel chapter 12, and let's look at verses 16 through 24. I want to just kind of paraphrase this for you and kind of ad-lib a little bit of stuff in here. But it says this. And David begged God to spare the child. Bathsheba was pregnant, the baby was born, and then the baby gets very, very sick. It's near death, and David is freaking out like all of us new dads, and he don't know what to do. And so he's on the floor praying, crying, and weeping, and it says, David begged God to spare the child, and he went without food. In other words, he was fasting, and he lay all night bare on the ground. He's praying to God, and the leaders of the nation, because if you remember, David is the king of Israel, pleaded with David to get up and to eat with them, but he refused, it says in the Bible. And then on the seventh day, the baby died. So this has been going on for days. No food, no eating, just praying. And it says on the seventh day, the baby died, and David's advisors were afraid to tell him because he was so broken up by the baby being sick. They were like, well, what is David going to do when we now tell him that his baby is dead? So they come and tell him. David says, why are you whispering? And he realized what had happened. And he said, is the baby dead? And they said, yes. And so that sets up our story tonight to see what David did and how he surrendered and how he began to pull out of this catastrophic event, which I think is one of the worst events that can happen to anybody, is the loss of a child. But the Bible is here, and it doesn't leave out the messes of the world. But as we walk through here, I want to give you 6 steps of surrender, and we're going to go right in the Bible and to see what David did when he got a catastrophic report that his child was dead. Now, for all of us, it's going to be a little bit different. Some may got a catastrophic report at the doctor. You've got cancer. Some people may have gotten a catastrophic report from the sheriff saying they don't want to be with you anymore. Some of you, it comes in all shapes and sizes. And when this catastrophic event comes and you've gone through those stages, and again, how long does it take? I don't know. But I'm telling you, there is a redemptive purpose if you're a child of God and you will surrender. There is a pathway to peace, even in the worst of circumstances. And I'm just going to give 6 principles here of surrender. We're going to see 6 steps of surrender. And if we'll take the same steps that David took, we can begin to find peace in our lives. So, what does David do after a major loss? Is he going to let this major loss destroy him? Is it going to define him? Or is it going to develop him? When you've had a major loss, there are the 3 things that they can do. They can destroy you. They can define you for the rest of your life. Or they can develop you. And what we're going to see is how David took a catastrophic loss and he began to let it develop him into the man of God that God wanted him to be. So David does 6 things. The first thing I need to do if I want to get on the pathway to peace after I've been through a catastrophic event and I've gone through those first 3 steps, the first thing I need to do is accept what cannot be changed. And we're going to see right here that David did this very thing. You have to accept what cannot be changed if you're going to heal and find peace. Let's look at David. The first thing I have to do, this first step of surrender, I have to accept what cannot be changed. When people receive bad news, what is their first response to it? I just don't believe it. There's no way, no. I mean, they're rejecting it. But slowly, reality starts to set in, and you can't deny it anymore. That's where surrender comes in, and surrender is accepting the reality. Here's what David did in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 22 and 23. David said this, I have fasted and wept while the child was alive, for I thought perhaps the Lord would be gracious and let the child live. But why should I fast when he is dead? Can I bring him back again? The answer to that is no. What is David doing here? He is accepting what cannot be changed. And when you've gone through a catastrophic event and you've been through those first 3 stages that we talked about, and you begin to heal and you begin to surrender, there is a pathway to peace. But the first step out of the 6 is simply saying, I accept what cannot be changed. And whatever loss you have had in your life, no matter what you've lost, the first thing you have to do is say, it is over. You accept what cannot be changed. Now, I want to be very clear about this. Acceptance does not mean that you stop caring. That's not what it means. Acceptance does not mean that it doesn't hurt any longer. It does. And acceptance doesn't mean that you even think that what happened is good, because it's not. None of that is acceptance. Acceptance is simply means I can't change. Can't change what's been done in my life or what's happened in my life. There's no way I can change it. Here's a question for you. What do you or I need to accept that is over in my life? Maybe it's that job that you keep thinking, maybe they're going to call me back and give me another chance. Or maybe you're thinking, I made a big mistake, I blew it, I really messed up. I really made a big mess and it's over. There's not going to be another chance. Maybe it's some relationship that's over. You just keep hoping that they'll come back, and you keep hoping that they're going to call you. They're not coming back. It's over. And when you realize that and you surrender and to say, Lord, there's nothing I can do. David could not bring this child back. He tried. And I don't understand why God did what he did. That's God's sovereignty. I can't explain that. But what I'm saying is that when we're on a pathway to peace and some catastrophic event has happened in your life and somebody's left you holding the bag, you got to accept it. You got to say, Lord, I accept where I'm at. That is the first step. The second step is to remember it's not the end of the story. And we're going to see what David did. Remember that it's not the end of the story. King David, as he experienced the loss of his son, he was able to focus on the hope that was ahead of him, believing that God wasn't finished. And look at 2 Samuel 12:23, he says this about his son. He said, I will go to him one day, but he cannot return to me. So when you're crawling out and you're surrendering, the second step is remember it's not the end of the story. Here David basically says, and he accepted, that I'm not going to see him on earth again and he can't come back to me. But how many of you know there's going to be a great reunion one day? Maybe some of you are here and have lost somebody very near and dear to your life. I want to tell you that if you know Jesus and they know Jesus, we're going to meet again. It's not the end of the story. And so when you're going through this process and you're going through the surrender, remember that it's not the end of the story. That God has a way. And that's what David did. He said, if I'm going to heal and I'm going to find a pathway to peace, I accept what can't be changed. Number one, first step. The second step, he says, remember it's not the end of the story, that I'm going to go where he is, that we have the hope in Christ, that we will meet and be reunited again. And the third step that he took when he was going through this catastrophe and he was trying to surrender is not to forget to take care of yourself. These are very practical things, but it's right here in God's Word. So when you go through something catastrophic in your life, don't forget to take care of yourself. You know, that may sound strange to some people, but every single one of these steps is important in the process of finding peace. 2 Samuel 12:20 says this, Then David got up from the ground, washed himself, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. After his son died, King David got up from the ground where he had been lying prostrate in grief, and he puts on lotions and he changed his clothes. You know, those may sound like ordinary activities. Taking a bath, changing clothes, they're everyday things. But when you're in grief, it takes all that desire away from you. You don't want to take a bath, you don't want to eat, you don't want to do anything. But David said that once he accepted it, and once he remembered that he's going to be with his son again, he says, I got to take care of myself. I got to go get cleaned up. And so here he is. He's taking that next step, and the message to you and I is when you hit those areas in your life, either what you've been through, what you're going through, or we hope not, but could go through sometime in the future. You got to do like David did. King David gives us a concrete example of how you can gradually begin to respond, because he had accepted that he couldn't change anything. He couldn't bring his child back, and because he knew it wasn't the end of the story, and that each day brought him closer to seeing his son again, that they would be reunited, he said, I've got to get up and get going. Now, it's a tough place to be, but you have to learn to live again. That we can simultaneously grieve and simultaneously live in the world at the same time. And man, that is a tough place to be, and it takes some time. But what I want to tell you is that David realized that I'm going to get up. I've prayed about it. He died. I accept that. I can't change it. I know we're going to be reunited. And so what I've got to do is do some duties and take care of myself. So, it's a tough place to be. But as we take care of ourselves, we go to the next part. Number 4, we refocus on God through worship. So number 1, accept what cannot be changed, as David did. Remember it is not the end of the story, as David did. Take care of yourself, as David did. And number 4, refocus on God through worship. So the fourth thing we need to do is to refocus on God through worship. God will help us do this no matter how difficult it seems. God will begin to help us to become more like Jesus. So we refocus on God through worship. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 20 says this. Then he, being David, went to the tabernacle and he worshiped the Lord. So the fourth step in this process of surrender and the pathway to peace that we see David taking after he had received catastrophic news is that he refocused on God through worship. Again, 2 Samuel 12:20 says, Then David went to the tabernacle and he worshiped the Lord. Psalm 73, verses 16 through 17 says this, I tried to understand all this, but it was too hard for me to see until I went into the temple of God. And I want to tell you, when you go through something, that's a great thing to have a home church that you can go through. How many of you are glad we got each other to go through this stuff with you? Man, I tell you what, whenever I go through something catastrophic or you, man, I can't wait to come into the house of God with God's people. There is healing in this place. Not because it's a church building, but because we're Christians and we're together. And here David says, when I've gone through this catastrophic event in my life, one of the ways back to the pathway of peace is to refocus on God through worship. Now the temptation in grief is to turn away from God. Amen? Something doesn't go your way, what you want to do. We want to get fired, and that's okay. I mean, we get those times because we are limited. We don't understand all that God's doing, and God can handle that. But the temptation is to turn away from God. It is to run from Him. It is to go as far the other direction as we can because we figure in some way God is responsible. So if He has allowed this to happen, we're mad, we're angry, we're shocked, we're heartbroken, we run. All of those emotions are okay, but not in the long-term response. There's a place for those emotions, and you need to work through those. But if you want to heal and you want to get on the pathway of peace, man, there's something wonderful about raising up, getting the shower, shaving, taking care of yourself, eating a breakfast, and coming into the house of God with God's people saying that we're going to make it. Because we realize in this world, bad things sometimes happen to good people. Example of what's happened to some of the police. And in this life, the fastest runner don't always win. I tell you, there's some little old ladies that have been in this church and this community that passed away. There's a handful of people that show up for the funeral. I mean, and they were faithful, 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 faithful to God. And then somebody dies that's a pop singer that is strung out on this or that and has molested children or whatever the situation may be. Millions of people come out. The fastest runner don't always win on this side of eternity. And some things and sometimes things are not fair. The little old lady who was faithful and put the $5 that she had and prayed for the church, and she passes away and hardly anybody even in the community comes. And was faithful to God. And then somebody dies and did all these horrible things to different people, and we make shrines and bring flowers and burn candles, and you don't always get fair treatment in this world. But God says, in the end, I'm going to right the wrongs. And I got a feeling we preachers are going to stand back for that little old lady and let her go up there and get her lesson because she was faithful. Might not have ever got it on this world, and sometimes, again, the fastest runner don't always win, and sometimes bad things happen to good folks in this world. Jesus said, in this world, you'll have trouble, tribulation, but take heart, I've overcome the world. So the temptation is to run the opposite way of the church and to hide. How many of you know it stays right there and it eats at you? And so what I'm saying tonight is the purpose of what we're talking about is leading to a pathway of peace. And we're looking at David's example and just watching the steps that he took to be able to have peace when he went through something catastrophic. And what I'm telling you and me, when we're in it or when we go through it next week or next year, whenever we face these things, if we take the same steps that David took and surrender and begin to take these steps, there is a pathway to peace. And God can take the worst thing that you ever thought could happen to you, and He can turn it into a testimony. I've heard testimonies of one lady who was raped. She was able to lead that man to the Lord. Now, how in the world did you do that? I don't know. But I know that we serve a God, and He can take the worst thing that you can think of, and if you give it to Him, He can bring a redemptive purpose, as He did here with David. So David went to God's house. He went to the tabernacle. There are two more steps, and then we'll be finished. So let's review. Steps of surrender. If you want to get to peace, you accept what cannot be changed. That's what David did. We saw that in our scripture. Number two, remember it's not the end of the story. That God's going to wrong the rights. Those that get all the praise down here on the earth and they live like the devil, and the little old lady that didn't get any recognition is going to be balanced in heaven. And so, this is not the end of the story. Number three, take care of yourself. Number four, refocus on God through worship. Come back to the house of the Lord where people love you and people can walk with you. Because sometimes you're going to be in a dilemma, and I'm not, and I want to be able to walk with you. And sometimes I'm going to be in a dilemma, and you're not, and I want you to be able to walk with me. What a wonderful thing that we have a church body to come together. So, two more steps on this path of peace that David did. So he does these 6 things when he has a crisis in his life, and you need to know these 6 things because we all going to have crises in our life. So the 5th thing that David does is this. Do something productive. Do something productive. When we're hit with an unexpected loss, what happens is we get paralyzed and we get stuck. So, the 5th step in David's recovery is in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 20. It says, after that, he got up from the ground, he washed himself, he put on lotion, he changed his clothes, and he goes to the temple to worship. And after that, he returned to the palace and ate. So what is that saying? Why did he go to the palace? Because he's the king. The palace is a place of productivity. The palace is where he works. He's basically saying, I'm going back to work. And this is the steps in the process when something catastrophic happened in David's life. He's saying it is important. And again, how long does it take? It's different times for different people. But what I'm saying is that at some point in your life, when you've gone through it, it is a pathway to peace to get back and to do something productive. Is it going to be hard? Yeah, it will be. Probably life sometimes won't ever quite be the same. But you begin to walk toward that peace. This is some of the hardest stuff that you'll ever do. You don't ever get over grief anyway. So remember that we said you don't get over it, you get through it. So he's still grieving, of course. Is he still sad? Yes. Is he still in a whirlwind as he's gone back to the palace? Yes. And you don't ever get over grief, but by God's grace you can get through it. There's a big difference in that. Some things that happen in our life we can't ever get over. Was David probably sad some days at the work and just cried out of no reason? Yes. And that's okay. But he's making the effort to set the alarm, to go and to shave and to wash and to get up and go to church and go to work and continue to do something. He was the king. He needed to be back in the palace. So, I want to challenge you as your pastor, somebody who loves you, to take a step of faith. I want you today to say that I'm going to do it. I'm mourning, but I'm going to start moving. Wherever you are. Somebody's watching on Facebook and you've gone through something catastrophic. I encourage you, even though you're mourning, to get moving and to trust God to help you walk through the valley of the shadow of death. How many of you know Jesus is there? The old song says, the God of the mountaintop is still God where? In the valley. The same God that's up there and you're having a great time, all life's going good, and like the examples I gave, and you're in the valley, the same God is right there. He's with you. This is the path to peace. There's one final step that David did in this passage that led him to peace. The sixth thing that David does is this. This is hard. Keep on loving even in your pain. Keep on loving even in your pain. In spite of your pain, keep on loving. Why do I have to say this? Because when you get hurt, the natural reaction is to pull into a shell, to build up giant walls around yourself and to say, I'm never going to let another man hurt me ever again. Or I'm never going to let another woman hurt me again. There's no way. It's too painful. So you pull in and you build walls and you build bridges. Don't build the wall around yourself. You've got to keep on loving even after you've been hurt. And this is what David did. If somebody turns you off, rejects you, shuts you down, what do you do? I want to tell you, there are plenty of people who need your love. If somebody shuts you down, you redirect your love. If you want peace in your life, don't build those walls around you and say, well, I've been hurt in the church before and I ain't opening up to nobody else. The people that hurt you, you just have to turn another direction and go to some people that need your love. Do you realize every one of you sitting in here has blessed me? I mean, everyone, I know everyone. And what I'm saying is that we need each other's love. And so what we got to do is keep on loving even in your pain. Do church folks hurt you? Sure, they're human. Do you get hurt in relationships? But that doesn't mean it's the end. How many of you know if you start the process of peace that God can bring you the right person in your life? But what we want to do is bring those walls and we close ourselves in. Well, I'm not going to love again.